I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed.
Our streets, our streets, our streets, our streets.
I have a dream.
Hello, I'm Anne Marie Johnson, and welcome to the final episode of Tears, the event against racism and stereotyping, defunding the fear with changemakers. In this episode, we'll meet three individuals who put aside their differences in order to work together to help improve the LAPD. We'll discuss several aspects of the LAPD's continual transformation with Connie Rice, award-winning civil rights activist and attorney. Nationally known for her unrelenting fight against systemic racism and advocacy for police reform, Ms. Rice is also co-founder of several organizations, including the Advancement Project. Charlie Beck, Chief of Police of the LAPD, who has given over 40 years to law enforcement. Mr. Beck is credited with the modernization and reimagining of the LAPD. After serving as its Chief of Police from 2009 to 2018, Mr. Beck retired, but was appointed Interim Police Superintendent in Chicago until 2020. Bernard Parks, who joined the force in the mid-60s, served over 38 years on the LAPD and was the first African American within the force to be appointed Chief of Police. Mr. Parks is credited with some of the most rigorous police reform within LAPD's history. After retiring from the force, he continued his life of service as a three-termed elected council member, representing the 8th District on the Los Angeles City Council. Mr. Parks has dedicated over 60 years of his life to public service. With Bernard Parks' forward-thinking policy changes, followed by the unorthodox and somewhat puzzling partnering of Connie Rice and Charlie Beck and their creation of the very successful Community Safety Partnership Program, the LAPD has changed for the better. And although our guests have been on opposing sides many times, they do share one important thing in common: their desire to help create a community needs comes first police department. And now, the final episode of Tears, the event against racism and stereotyping. Defunding the fear with changemakers.
Ed Davis was probably the visionary that moved the department farther along as relates to community activities than any other chief. He reorganized and decentralized the entire department. He reorganized and created basic CAR. He also invented the team policing. All of these programs came under his watch. Now, what's interesting is that Daryl Gates, who later became chief, was the person that implemented his ideas as the director of Office of Operations. What was also interesting, when he became chief, he basically moved away from some of the basic tenets of dealing with the community. And what you'll find as we move forward, in my judgment, we progressively have moved away from what the pure thought of community policing since Davis has left. When you take the senior lead officers out of the CAR and make them a special group, no longer is the rest of the department feel as though they have an inclusive involvement in dealing with the public. You have this us and them. I'm doing real police work, you go handle the community. And we progressively have moved away to now, it's almost impossible to find the community-based policing principles in what's going on today.
The way it started was the head of the housing authority in LA. The history of the housing authorities, they used to have their own police department. They disbanded it a couple of decades ago, but they kept some money in their budget for law enforcement, for policing. And Rudy Montiel, who was the head of the housing authority at the time, came to me and said, "Hey, we have some money for law enforcement, and I want to use it in in the big four housing developments, Jordan, Nickerson, Imperial, and Ramona Gardens. How do you want to spend it? So I said, well, let's try something a little different. Why don't we try a really community-oriented approach with officers that would be embedded into these communities in a different way, rather than in the typical enforcement mode. So let's do a couple things first. Let me talk to Connie Rice, and she and I were speaking frequently by then in a good way. So we weren't antagonists at that point of our relationship. And so let me talk to Connie. Let's have some community meetings. Let's get some input on what they want, and then we'll come up with a model. So what we did was we took that little bit of money and we used it to provide incentives, very small incentives. We're talking 5%, pay bonus, to find officers that wanted to be attached to these communities for long term in a mode where they would build community more than they would enforce the law. Because one of the other things I believe is a healthy community is a safe community. My last year as chief in Southeast, which has the three major housing developments, the clearance rate for homicides, and they still had homicides. I mean, it is still there's still violence there, but not as much in the housing developments. And the clearance rate for those homicides was in the 80 percentile, which was higher than the rest of the city.
My job is to empower the good officers. It's not to bring down all of policing. It's to empower the good officers. And that's the strategy that is created down the line. What we just stood up in LAPD, which is the country's first entire police bureau dedicated to wrap around safety policing that works with communities for healthy building. The whole goal of this policing model is to go beyond community policing to making the police part of a whole of government. You have a housing authority, you have public health, you have university professors, you have the Watts Gang Task Force, you have gang interventionists who do foot patrols. These cops do not get promoted for making an arrest or participating in the mass incarceration machinery. They get rewarded for not making arrests, for keeping a kid out of the prison pipeline, for helping a community organize to take back the public libraries and pools and school halls and the public parks that are controlled by gangs. I'm talking about gang-controlled pockets of LA that live in terror. And we're offering exit ramps out of the gangs. Gang members who lay down their guns and join with making the park safe and barbecuing for kids. Summer night lights, we keep the parks open until 11 o'clock at night to reduce the violence. So it's a violence reduction, safety increasing, health building policing model. It is radical. And the chief who came up with it is Charlie Beck of the LAPD. And yes, I was co-conspirator in that. It's not perfect, but it is 180 degrees away from shock and awe, search and destroy, mass incarceration, destructive enforcement, which is what most urban police departments do.
Probably the most misused word in policing today is the word community-based policing. Because if you go to a meeting and you ask people, do you support community-based policing? They'll all say yes. If you ask them, what do you think it is? You'll get as many answers as the people who are answering.
I think the community is completely bought into getting policing that's humane, policing that helps, policing that does not destroy. And if we're lucky, get CSP cops, community safety partnership policing, with the wraparound safety all of government strategy. That's how you end the spiral of despair that the McCone Commission was talking about.
The reality is that, this comes under attack like every other policing program right now, which is too bad, because I think people are throwing everything into the same bucket, and everything is not in the same bucket. But I also think that the department has a tremendous amount of resolve to continue this program. because it's been successful. The one thing that will save, and I would tell people all the time, is the thing that will save you is success. You know, nobody, you know, even though it's maybe seen as Charlie and Connie's program, whoever succeeds us will embrace it if it works, you know, because the overarching desire of people to get in these kind of positions is to succeed. So Chief Moore has done some expansion of the program. He's put a very talented deputy chief in charge, Amada Tingrides, who was one of the original supervisors that we selected for the Community Safety Partnership. And, you know, so it is now becoming a walking, talking entity within the department that will survive. So I think that's a very, very positive thing and something I'm very proud of.
The will for change is good and needed. But if the will isn't backed by all levels of government, along with their financial support, all the will in the world can't make significant or sustainable change. Connie and Bernard share their thoughts on this conundrum.
When I look at American policing and I say, people hear me say, LA, this is not your grandfather's LAPD, they look at me like I'm nuts. But what I mean by that is that what has changed in American policing is at the top. The executive level has changed dramatically. There are chiefs of all races who can finish my sentences in terms of reform. So you have police executives, that there's a progressive wing of police executives. There are also the sheriffs of Kenosha who say stuff to the American print and media, like I would take all black shoplifters and put them in a stadium and sterilize them. So you've got the NVN NHI wing of American policing. That's nigger versus nigger, no human involved. Proud Boys wing, insurrectionist, sedition caucus in policing. And then you've got 180 degrees. You've got the progressive chiefs who are creating entire bureaus. Well, there's one chief, Chief Moore and Chief Beck, who have stood up a Guardian model that is not about crush and control, search and destroy, new Jim Crow enforcement. They're about building and healing wraparound safety for poor African Americans, poor Latinos, and I would say poor underclass folks of every race. And for us to simply focus on the police is a mistake. The police have a huge role, and I'm not talking about, you know, drumming out racist cops and the Proud Boy cops and the NVN NHI wing of the police department. We need to purge that. The Christopher Commission told us to purge that stuff and move to community policing. The McCone Commission 55 years ago gave the prescription, which was fix your cops, make them do community policing, but government, whole of government, you stop the spiral of despair. Bottom line is that when we look at this, you have to look at the whole of government solution, because until you reorganize government to do the things that are smart to ask for, like reduce the interaction, have mental health officials interact with the mentally ill who are on Skid Row and who are endangering people, instead of sending a cop in there to make someone with mental illness even sicker and more desperate and usually killed when they interact with police, send out the mental health, the counselors, the social workers, the homeless placement folks. Send a team out there to help this human being instead of killing him. And when Chief Beck of LAPD told the County of Los Angeles, the richest and biggest local government entity in the country, it's bigger than many states, billions of dollars, that's where you go for them. You go there and you go to the Defense Department for the money.
We all know what makes things run in the city anyway is when you budget for it. If you take money out of something or don't put money into it, it's just conversation. When you put money into it, you're telling people, this is my operating plan for this many a month. Governmental buy-in is a direct correlation of community participation. I always thought it was amazing to me when I was the budget chair to take the budget committee around the city and only have 15 people show up. And we're talking about $8 billion budget. And you're saying you're not interested in where the funding goes? Now, they might show up or call or write a letter and say, I think A, B, and C should be done. But when you try to get a group of people to say, here's what we're going to spend next year, where do you think we should put the priorities?
Most of these politicians, it's like day trading. They're not there. They're not going to get the benefit. They're not going to get a photo op on a 30-year cultural transformation of policing project. They're not going to get to take a bow. And when they come in, they're like, oh, I've got whatever I thought up in the shower this morning is what we're going to do. Well, no, this stuff takes sustained strategy that is developed by the experts and the community together.
The LAPD was founded in 1869, and with it came the viciousness of slave patrols and KKK practices. It wasn't until 1889 that the first African American was hired to the force. And just like every other police department in this country, the LAPD was not immune to the original concept of policing. But through the hard work of our three guests and others within the LAPD and local and federal government, incredible strides have been made. But there's more to do.
Connie and I have been to several places in the country to talk, and we went to the museum, and of course, you know, the impact of seeing the connection between some really bad times in American history to the present is you know, takes your breath away, really, if you haven't thought of it. And I really hadn't, you know, I have heard the correlation between slave catchers and police, you know, and of course I mean, that's not my reality. I mean, I never saw myself that way, but you certainly see how people could. I mean, there are similarities, and especially when, you know, communities of color, you know, have much more police presence than other communities, and you know, you start to think that, well, that's why, you know, and I look at it and I go, well, that's because, you know, we get more 911 calls in that neighborhood. You know, there's more violent crime in that neighborhood, so we have to put more police in that neighborhood, which I think will continue, but you got to have police that understand that, you know, understand why, and it's not because we're there to suppress the community, it's because we're there to keep the community safe, and they're not the same thing.
But what concerns me today, in talking to young Black officers, you find that they often have ignored or do not know from whence they came. They don't have an appreciation that in years past, Black officers didn't get hired. There was an appreciation. They didn't get promoted. They didn't work special assignment. Now today, Black officers are looking at each other saying, what are you talking about? Like we had years ago, we had a seminar and a Black officer made this comment that he wouldn't have tolerated what went on in the 60s. And you said, you wouldn't have been here. You wouldn't have to worry about tolerating, because they would have said to you, and your father could tell you this, bring your hat and books. And that's the last time you would be seen. I mean, so these are things that they think because they grew up in an organization and they saw Black sergeants, Black lieutenants, Black captains, female. They think that's the way it's always been. Not understanding or appreciating their history, that in years past, you weren't even given a consideration. It was beyond benign neglect. These are things that you find is that there's really a lack of appreciation of how things have gotten to where they are, and some are great or better than it used to be, but it's still a long way to go.
The police are just the enforcers of a system that the whole of government, the whole of the criminal justice system has given an architecture, a mandate, and a mission for, and they enforce it. That's the piece of it that's harder for people to wrap their minds around. I'm talking about the culture, the DNA of American policing. And you've got a lot of very good people in policing who carry out a toxic mission that descends from slavery.
Can real positive change happen if we don't care to listen, or are unable to have compassion or commonality with each other? As Maya Angelou once said, I think we all have empathy. We may not have enough courage to show it.
Dealing with empathy and sympathy. You got to be sympathetic to people's plight. You can't have this attitude of, hey, it doesn't bother me. I'm just here. You can't be Joe Friday, just the facts and nothing else. The empathy part starts with, if you've not experienced it, often it's very difficult to have empathy if you've never been in that situation. When I came in 65, we had officers that were joining LAPD that for the first time in their life, they were in downtown LA. Because they lived in the valley, they never, ever found a reason to go to downtown LA. Well, you begin to realize all these cultures that are mixed in a community. There are people finding out about, they didn't know that Asians were here and Blacks were there. And they have these mindsets that often are based on their background, which could be a completely false view of what the world is.
My epiphany in policing came through empathy, in that, you know, I was a young gang supervisor working in Watts, and you know, I became a father, and so when I started, you know, and unfortunately, when in this time period within the LAPD and the city of LA, you know, we had, I think the year that I'm talking about in the late 90s or mid 90s, we had over 100 homicides in that 10 square mile area of Watts. And so, I started, you know, and so because I went to all of them, I'd be standing over my victims who were all pretty much young men. And I look down, I see my son. And so, you know, you start feeling, you know, when you're a young cop, unfortunately, because you see so many things that are so difficult, you know, you build a crust to try to, and, you know, kind of a natural reaction is to build a hardness, you know, but eventually you get, at least I got to the point where I started becoming much softer and understanding, you know, better what the dynamics were that create this issue, you know, and not just demonizing folks that are involved, but recognizing that, you know, hey, you know, but happenstance of birth, that could have been me or my sons. Cops are a reflection of society, you know, and sometimes when we look at that reflection, we don't like what we see. So, you know, it's about all of us, and it's about all of us getting through this together to make our communities safer and more successful. And there are certainly ways that the police can help to do that, but it has to be, you know, with understanding and with empathy, and on both sides.
The first of all civil rights is the right to safety, and the first of all freedoms is freedom from violence. If you don't have those two, none of the other rights matters. We all have a role in this nonsense. And until we understand that, yeah, there's the racial corruption of American policing started in 1619. We get that. The wanton cruelty, obviously, the savagery has to stop. And it's like Martin Luther King Jr. said, all we did with the Civil Rights Revolution was get white America to agree to end brutality. White America did not agree to full equality in any way. And his question was, will we be willing to give up what we benefit from in order to achieve the American promise? Because right now we've got an uncollected promissory note, as he used to say. And we're no closer to cashing it than when he died. So I guess what I'm saying is that, as when my grandmother said, you haven't earned the right to give up until you've had to sit in a dark room in Birmingham, Alabama, with a long gun over your knee waiting for the Klan. You don't have the right to. She said, you've got crystal stairs to walk on, quoting Langston Hughes. She said, girl, you got crystal stairs. We opened all the doors. Get out there and run your leg of the relay. Justice is a relay. And I don't think it's too late. I just think that the conversations that we're having now are kind of stuck in an unproductive mode. And the lessons of changing from within policing, that's the only route that I've seen produce mindset transformation.
Thank you to Connie Rice, Charlie Beck, and Bernard Parks for joining us. The Mankind Initiative founder Richard Steller and I would like to thank all of our guests for participating in this series. Through the strength of the spoken word, the arts, and music, we've delved into sensitive and somewhat challenging topics with honesty and respect. We hope you found this series informative but also entertaining. Here at the Mankind Initiative, we believe one of the best ways to bridge gaps is by building bridges. Through community engagement, music, the arts, and the spoken word, our mission is to bring people together for the betterment of mankind. For more information and for ways to support our mission, please visit mankindinitiative.org. That's www.mankindinitiative.org. I'm Anne Marie Johnson, and again, thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, be kind.